All nannies spat upon by the billionaire's son, the headline would have said if anyone outside that apartment block ever believed headlines could tell the whole truth. A toddler in a silk-lined room, forcing himself into a small, furious rebellion. A row of professional women backing away with pale faces. And then, against the marble and the hush of glass, a janitor's hymn bending the chaos into something like mercy. Aaliyah Johnson arrived that morning already tired in her bones. She had worked the night shift at a downtown office tower, pushing a cart of cleaning supplies through corridors that smelled of lemon and nerves. She had a ledger of missed rent notices folded into the pocket of her coat, a voicemail from a neighbor who needed money for an insulin refill, and the image of her son in a photograph taped to the inside of a locker. Elijah's small hand still curled when she had chosen a path she could not yet explain to anyone. She lived by appointments: wash, feed, call, count. Pride and need kept her steady. The Ellington penthouse was not in any guidebook for fists of workaday faith. It rose above the city like a private vow, a doorman who knew every delivery in the neighborhood, polished brass fixtures, and the kind of quiet that felt like pressure. Aaliyah had been hired that week on a tent basis, sweeping and sanitizing the nursery after the staff was replaced in a rash effort to find someone, anyone, who could steady Trey. The man in the photographs, Trey's father, Dwayne, moved in a kind of practiced restraint that made the house breathe in measured exhalations. That morning began with a sound Aaliyah had not expected to meet inside a home of glass and gray. Trey threw himself at the world the way grief teaches children to test edges. He spat, he shoved, he screamed until the mouth of the room was full of spit and alarm. Two professional nannies backed away, hands fluttering for safety and for dignity. One woman, who had been with the family for nearly a year, wept into her scarf, saying a soft thing about not being cut out for this level of brokenness. There was a thin line between this place and a hospital room where the staff knew the names of every ache. Dolores watched from the doorway with the old, exacting impatience of someone who had long ago learned how households fell apart at the seams. She had been there longer than anyone, white hair in a coil at the nape, hands that still smell faintly of starch and sage from a lifetime of linen. To her, every spill was a failing and every error a decision. She carried the family's history like a duty. Aaliyah stepped forward because standing still felt impossible. She had not meant to make a scene. She had not planned to be central or heroic. She swept because that was what she did. She picked up other people's fragments and made them shine. Her palms were dry from cleaning chemicals. The scent of citrus and bleach clung to her sweater.
She crouched until she was level with Trey's little fist and let her voice find a hymn she had learned in the kitchen of a church in Macon, a tune low and circular and familiar. The sound of that hymn did something small and precise. It did not fix his grief. No song could scrape the way a child's world had ripped, but it caught the edge of him. Something in the rhythm softened. Trey's fists dropped. His face, knocked raw from crying, went slack for a breath. He blinked, and then, as if testing the truth of the note, he leaned in and pressed his cheek to Aaliyah's. It was an almost accidental contact, a child searching for a center. Her cheek stung where Dolores's palm had landed earlier that morning, a hot red line blooming under her jaw. The sting and the small warm weight of the child against her made Aaliyah feel like she was being reshaped. Dwayne watched from the doorway, hands folded at the seam of his suit as if he were holding in a response. His face was an architecture of restraint, angles and a muscle around the jaw that had not yet learned how to relax since Helena's funeral. He had been ready to hire someone with credentials, a kind of person whose paper trail would map safely onto the life he knew. He had not expected to be jarred by a hymn and a janitor's steady hands. The sight of Trey pressing his small cheek to Aaliyah's like a moth to a porch light unsettled something under his sternness. It suggested a language he had forgotten. Earlier, Dolores had done what Dolores did, exact priorities with the bluntness of someone guarding a threshold. She had found Aaliyah a service elevator, jacket smeared with cleaning solution, and eyes tired from nights of balancing a world on a meager wage, and she had spat a sharper judgment than the toddlers. Aaliyah had brushed past the slap with a silent, measured exhale. The sting stayed on her skin. The shame landed deeper. Dolores's disapproval was a kind of housekeeping, keeping the family's perimeter polished against what she called unknowns. The insult of it did not make Aaliyah want revenge. It made her think of the repairable smallness of one life. Dwayne's offer was made in a voice that held back more than it revealed. "Stay," he said. "For now, live on the premises, see if he responds." It was not an invitation wrapped in promises. It was a test and a necessity for both of them. For Aaliyah, it was shelter and wages, and crucially, proximity, an answer to rent notices and to Elijah's photograph taped into the corner of a locker. For Dwayne, it was the experiment he could not quantify. Would a different sort of presence coax a little boy back toward a world that had not yet named what he had lost? Aaliyah hesitated because it is one thing to say that you will give your labor to a family. It is another to give yourself to a house whose every room thrummed with wealth and greed.
But necessity made decisions into small cleats under her feet. The offer felt like a plank thrown to someone treading dark water. She said yes, and she said it with the plainness she reserved for moments that required only truth. She would stay for the money, for the weeks, for the chance that being close would mean being there when a child needed a human anchor. They found a cot in the nursery for her, nothing like the bed she had in her room above a shop. The cot smelled faintly of disinfectant and lemon, but that small slope of mattress became, that week, the most important place in the house for many reasons. At night, Aaliyah hummed again. The song took on new meanings in the hush of the nursery, the steadying oak of her voice against the rising swell of a small, grieving child. Trey began to sleep in longer stretches. He learned to find the cadence in her hand on his back. He woke less in yawns of panic and more in slow increments of recognition. The house routes had rules that were not always written. Aaliyah learned them tooth by patient tooth. She polished the wooden toys on Trey's shelf until the grain gleamed. She folded tiny clothes with the same care she had given quilts in the past. In the morning, she made pancakes at the stove like a ritual, the batter thick and comforting, pressing into the small domestic acts that stitch lives back together. She took Trey to the park and taught him to point at things, an effort toward renaming the world as safe. He began to say small words, the first fragile bridges back to language. Once, under a sky turned butter pale, he lifted his voice, and the word stumbled out. "Mama." The word was not a claim. It was an offering of a route to comfort, not a statement about lineage or title. Aaliyah did not correct him. She let the small miracle sit like a babble that would be smoothed by time. Dwayne heard it from the living room and felt something crack inside him that had been brittle for months. He folded his hands and let the sound pass like a tide. He was careful not to overstep into the tiny, sacred commerce between a child and his caretaker. He watched instead, learned these small rituals, and found that grief could be met with quiet constancy. Dolores remained watchful and, at times, openly hostile. Her control was the house's first law. Do not bring in chaos. Aaliyah took her sharp tones as part of the room's friction. Dolores called her girl in ways that hurt, but did not diminish Aaliyah's determination. Over the course of days, Dolores's brusqueness softened into something like grudging respect. She began to leave the nursery door open a fraction more often. When she noticed that Aaliyah could quiet Trey with a tilt of voice and the right hand on a small shoulder, she adjusted her stance. She did not apologize. She repaired. Victoria Hale remained at first a voice on the telephone. She was a woman for whom presentation was a moral project.
Her name arrived folded into the house like a ledger, clean, precise, a reputation built on legacy and stewardship. She was the aunt with a stake in the family's public image, a guardian of what the Ellington name meant in the city's frames. Her first interactions with Aaliyah were cool and measured. She asked about qualifications. She asked about history. Her questions had the edge of someone who believed that pedigree mattered. She had been Helena's sister by blood and by the small belief systems families pass down. Certain things are worth preserving at a cost. Dwayne handled those calls with a care that wore him thin. He tried to explain that what they needed was less pedigree and more constancy. He tried to remind Victoria that grief bears no hierarchy of qualification. He was careful with words because he knew that his sister-in-law would weaponize anything that sounded like uncertainty. Grief could be framed as negligence by people who wanted control. The first week measured itself in small salvage operations. Aaliyah learned that Trey would calm if she let him hold the small stuffed lion, an heirloom of sorts that had been with him since infancy. She learned the map of his triggers, alarms on the street, the scent of a particular lotion, the flicker of a television commercial. She learned to speak in small, repetitive phrases that rooted his attention in the room. The rituals were not glamorous, they were steadying. Dishes done at exactly the same rhythm, the positioning of the pillow, the precise way she would wrap a soft blanket. The household, which had been arranged for an adult world of meetings and donor dinners, found itself reoriented toward this tiny axis of need. People rearranged what mattered. There were privileges to the house that hit Aaliyah with a stranger's awe. The kitchen had a refrigerator with a door that hummed like a small cathedral, full of produce she could never have afforded. The view from the windows made her dizzy with a kind of longing, cities rolled out like cloth at the horizon. Yet the house was also a stage for power. Dolores watched visitors with a scrutiny honed over decades. Victoria watched over the phone with a sharper lens. Their scrutiny felt less like curiosity and more like evaluation. Aaliyah felt the weight of it as the constant question, who are you to hold a child whose place in this family is defined by blood and money? Her own private life was not a topic of conversation here. There were a few people who knew pieces of her story. Lucille Holloway, an old neighbor who had been a nurse and had kept Aaliyah when she had needed help years ago. The adoptive family who had raised Elijah and kept the photograph in the promise that he was safe. Aaliyah carried those facts like a folded letter, not discussed in public, but never far from her hands. Dwayne retreated often to the study where a collection of Helena's things sat like shrines.
Mirrored frames with photographs of their wedding, a scarf Helena had left on a chair, little relics that had grown into heavy symbols. He had not cried since the funeral, not properly. Sometimes at night, when the city outside the penthouse windows softened to a velvet of distant lights, he would stand by the nursery door and allow the small noises, Trey's slow breath, the whisper of Aaliyah's humming, to be the only sound in the apartment. He found himself thinking, with a startling clarity that startled even him, that perhaps someone who had not been raised in wealth could still offer what Trey needed: presence, patience, constancy. The household staff began to chatter in the way staff will, whispers in the laundry room, raised eyebrows by the pantry. Some of it was concern, some of it was the small human habit of talking through change. Rumors circulated about Aaliyah's past, as rumors do, and Dolores, ever the keeper of the house's pantries, kept an eye on social media, overheard court updates, and kept a mental list of what needed to be defended. Tensions pricked when Victoria flew into town for a meeting that smelled of perfumes and decisions. She arrived with a legal pad and the look of someone who imagined the world as a ledger. She came for appearances and for assurance. She sat with Dwayne at the long dining table and asked questions that had the tilt of someone testing foundations. "What sort of checks did you run?" she asked, voice polished, not accusing exactly, but carving into the room with a cold precision. She prided herself in being the guardian of the family's narrative. To her, public perception had shape and cost. Dwayne answered with the same clipped control he used in other rooms, the words shaped as if placed into a bank vault. He told her about the first days, about the hymns, the static of the child quieting, the small rise of sleep. He did not exaggerate. He did not claim miracles. He watched her face for the softening he had glimpsed in the doorway weeks before, but Victoria's features held a map of mistrust. "These things can look very different from the inside," she said, "especially when there are cameras." The word came with no accusation yet, but with the suggestion of a method and a tool. Surveillance would be the language she would come to speak in. Aaliyah recognized the tone. She had been on the receiving end of scrutiny all her life. It was a kind of grammar for people who had power. She kept her mouth small and steady. She did not offer explanations that were larger than her life. She had learned the economy of truth. Give enough, not so much that your frame collapses under the price of confession. Even as she found footholds inside that household, the city's machinery of power churned under the surface. Victoria began to outline what seemed like sensible precautions. "We must consider appearance," she told Dwayne, almost as if the appearance of care could be calibrated. "For the board, for donors, for the boy's future." There was a meeting at which Dolores sat across from Victoria and gave a blunt account of how the nursery had been managed. Dolores did not mince words. Her loyalty, fierce and practical, had its own logic. She said, in a gravel tone, that the child needed consistent rules, and that some people could not give them. Her loyalty to the house was obvious. Hers was protection by order. In the lull after that meeting, Aaliyah found a quiet corner and let her hands rest in her lap. The home might be a penthouse, but the same human textures existed there as in the rent-stacked rooms of her past. Fear, hope,
the small, available choice to show up. She chose each day to show up as a person invisible ended into someone needed. The early days' triumphs were simple and slow. Trey learned to sleep an extra hour. He began to clasp the lion toy to his chest. He produced the word mama again and again, as if testing its echo. Aaliyah watched him, sometimes in the doorway of the nursery, when the light made the wooden floor a plate of honey. She let the word settle into her like a small medicine. It was not a claim against another. Dwayne was a father whose grief hung in the house like a shadow, but it was a naming of a need met. She would not say aloud what it did to her to be the one who soothed a child who had been spat upon by every caretaker the family had hired. It made her feel both fragile and fierce. Then, a week into her stay, an envelope arrived that carried the house's particular coldness. It came out by courier, but by a legal assistant, who left it on Dwayne's desk like a stone. The paper inside was precise, the language meticulous. It suggested concerns about the child's welfare and asked for a formal review. When Dwayne read the document, he felt the room diminish around the edges, a tightening he could not easily explain. Victoria had moved beyond polite conversation. He found Aaliyah in the nursery cleaning a small smear of jam from a book's corner. He sat opposite the cot and told her what had arrived, words chosen for clarity and not for alarm. He said the thing the house had feared, that someone was not content with the story they had been telling in private, that someone viewed their decisions through a lens more public and less forgiving. Aaliyah's mouth closed like a hinge. She had known the risk of being visible in a house that prized a certain narrative. She had not thought her presence would prompt legal scrutiny. She had thought, naively perhaps, that tenderness was its own protection. Now, with the document between them, there was a new, colder shape to their days. That night she lay on her cot and recast the hymn in the dark, letting each note be a small domestic prayer. There was a soft knock on the nursery door the next morning. It was Margaret Sutter, the court-appointed child advocate, whose name had been whispered in the staff room like a bell.
She was all unadorned practicality, a short haircut, a voice that had been trained on dozens of cases, and a gaze that read a room without theatricality. She told them she would observe, that she would meet with staff and the child and submit a report. This was how the law worked in small, plodding increments. Hear, report, recommend. It was not theater, it was procedure. Aaliyah found herself answering questions with an economy that came from the necessity of survival. She described routines, the steps she took to build safety, the small ministrations that formed the fabric of care. Trey sat at her knee and drew circles on a notepad as if the world could be remapped that way. Margaret watched the way he reached for Aaliyah and made a note. She did not offer a verdict. Her job was to notice. But Victoria's influence moved in quieter channels as well. There were side conversations, phone calls that ended abruptly, memos with headlines redacted, a private investigator's discreet inquiry about staff records. Aaliyah felt the house grow smaller with each calculated move. Rumors, it turned out, were not merely gossip. They were instruments. Someone wanted to make a case out of the ordinary truth of a woman who had once made a painful decision in her own life. There were nights when Aaliyah's mind drifted back to a summer, months old and far away, to the time she had held the small body she could not yet keep. She remembered the nurse who had wrapped her in a clean white sheet and the smell of antiseptic. She remembered the way a counselor had used the word overwhelmed like a diagnosis, and the way her own choices had been made under a pressure she had not the means to resist. She did not tell the house those things, because they were private, and because the honesty of them would not have simplified anything here. They were the seams of an old life she had stitched closed with iron and soft apologies. In private, Lucille Holloway, who had been more like family than neighbor, would sometimes hold Aaliyah's hands and say the small things one does when they cannot fix a wound but can witness it. You did what you had to do. You gave him a better life. Lucille had been a nurse and had seen women in hard places make choices that did not strip them of dignity. She had said the word sovereign once in a way that made Aaliyah laugh and then cry. The word felt large enough to hold a mistake and a redemption. The house was changing around them, the staff tentatively adopting new norms, the child's toy shelf a little less chaotic, the living room holding fewer unacknowledged silences, and yet there were gears grinding just beneath the surface, the city's machinery of reputation beginning to purr.
Victoria's phone call suggested that appearance cost less than the knowledge of the truth. Dwayne, who had once thought wealth could most easily purchase protection, began to understand that money did not always buy the moral clarity he needed.
He hired counsel who began to map a defense, and in quiet evenings he asked Aaliyah about her boundaries and what she needed to feel safe. He did not press her on private matters she had not volunteered. His gentleness felt foreign to Aaliyah. He had been a man of appointments and vessels, and yet it was real. It arrived as a different kind of offering, not ownership, but partnership in the smallest ways, like asking permission before moving a toy, or staying silent in the doorway while she soothed the boy. And still, the house kept its eyes. A photograph on a desk, a candid shot taken years earlier of Helena laughing at a summer party, made a misgiving loop in Dwayne's chest. He thought of how quickly the city could turn a private life into something else. He had watched it before, slow motion, as donors whispered, as board members signed their names on documents that rearranged loyalties. He understood that to defend Aaliyah and Trey would require more than a tidy press release. It would require telling a story people could see themselves in. It was in the gap between those decisions that the first public whisper arrived. A call from Victoria's assistant suggested caution. A note from the family's PR firm suggested a tight script. Aaliyah sat at the nursery windowsill and held the lion toy until it felt like an anchor. She hummed her hymn again, whispering the words like a weather forecast for a small heart. Trey lay with his head on her knee, chest rising and falling with a child's slow tides. He had spat, and he had been spat upon. And yet he was learning, clumsily and bravely, how to trust small gestures. When the formal notification came a few days later, an emergency petition filed in the city's family court, it landed like winter ice. The document did not say much that was new, concerns about the child's welfare, an appeal for review. But paper has a gravity a voice does not. It makes the abstract into a thing you can put your hand on. Dwayne read it and folded it with a hand that had once folded contracts and donor lists. He did not flinch. He had the resources to fight. He had legal counsel and a staff prepared to defend him. What he did not have was a manual for the strange new ethics of being a father who had to guard a child's privacy against a family who believed that lineage was the primary currency. Aaliyah understood, suddenly, that presence alone did not inoculate her against scrutiny. Her current life, the cot, the humming, the small domestic economies, sat now under a different light. She had become not merely a caregiver, but a public figure in a small and vulnerable drama. Her choice to stay had been both necessity and generosity. She had not anticipated that generosity itself would be interrogated. The petition set the household into motion. Margaret Sutter's visits grew more formal. There were interviews at the city courthouse scheduled for signatures and preliminary hearings.
The staff were instructed to limit comment to a single rehearsed sentence. The child's safety was paramount. Victoria began to speak more often at board meetings, her voice glazed with the language of stewardship. Dwayne's legal team suggested a media strategy that weighed the risk of silence against the danger of exposure. Aaliyah sat in the nursery one evening, the city like a map of tiny lights below, and let herself breathe for the first time in days. Trey slept in the crook of her arm. She thought of Elijah. She let the photograph of his round cheeks and curious eyes unspool in her mind like a small film, and she felt, unmistakably, the ache of a life partitioned. The petition did not yet say anything about her past, but already the gears of gossip were warming, and she knew how easily a private wound could be turned public. She resolved, quietly, not to let shame dictate the terms of her existence. She would not cower. She would continue to sing the hymn and to make pancakes, and to press a child's cheek when he needed it. If the world decided to make narratives out of her, she would not give it the satisfaction of bluffing. There would be battles ahead. There would be legal papers and questions she might not want to answer. But for now there was the boy who had pressed his cheek to hers, who had found in her voice a small shape of safety. For now, that would be enough. Outside, Victoria prepared for the next move. She had allies who understood how public perception could alter private decisions, a board that had to reassure donors, a family tree that could not be allowed to fray. She believed in legacy in a way that could justify measures most would find cold. Her mind ran in schedules and outcomes, and she began to draw up the first lines of a case. In so doing, she set into motion a longer, noisier exchange, legal filings, potential forensics, public relations,
that would extend beyond the nursery walls. When the first formal summons to court arrived at the family's office, Dwayne's assistant handed it to Aaliyah rather than to the legal team, as if telling her first was a courtesy of some sort. Aaliyah accepted it with both hands, the paper crisp and heavy. She read the clinical paragraphs, the names of legal counsel, and the date of the preliminary hearing. Her name sat in ink on a page among formal predicates. She folded the sheet and slid it into the pocket of her jacket, as if it were a token she might not yet own. She slept that night with the paper under her pillow, as if it were a talisman. In the morning, she hummed the hymn like an argument for small mercies, and set about her work, while outside the city kept turning, indifferent and enormous. The first act of any story is not its end, it is its arrangement. The nursery's light would change in the weeks to come, streaked with courtroom fluorescence, camera lenses, and a public that had always wanted a tidy version of truth.
For now, in the room that smelled of lemon and small human ordinariness, a janitor turned nanny held a child, and a billionaire stood in the doorway and watched, and both of them felt the shape of something vast pressing at their edges. If this scene grabbed you, stay with us. What happens when private care collides with public power changes more than one life. The summons slid into the rhythm of the house like a bone into a river, inevitable, cold, and destined to change whatever current existed. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a week out, and the days until then unfolded like a carefully measured chore chart. Meetings, calls, a tightening of calendars, and the dull, constant hum of waiting. For Aaliyah, the week was a series of small sanctities, the exact fold of a blanket, the way the lion toy sat on Trey's chest in the morning like a small sentinel, the steadying round of pancakes on a Saturday, when Dwayne, on a rare morning free of meetings, joined them at the table and let the house feel, briefly, like a place where the grief could be gentled. There were staff confabs that smelled of coffee and the metallic tang of worry. Legal counsel arrived to map defenses and to press for a narrative that would not surrender control to rumor. Margaret Sutter wrote notes in a way that looked less like preparation and more like cataloging truth. She insisted on spending time alone with Trey, playing with blocks until he selected shapes with the sort of grave concentration that had once been a child's small, untroubled empire. Dolores, who had watched the house for longer than anyone, shifted between guard and ally in a way that surprised even herself. She asked Aaliyah, in that blunt, private way she had, whether she wanted her to speak in court. Aaliyah's answer, yes, if it helps the boy, hardened something between them that was both professional and inexplicably tender. Across town, Victoria tightened the screws in rooms that smelled of cedar and strategy. She met with Carlton Grant in a boardroom with a long table and a city skyline like evidence behind them. They rehearsed lines about precedent and optics, about duty and the responsibility to protect a bloodline. Carlton was precise, legal in temperament, a man who built arguments like walls. He suggested aggressive motions, requests for a forensic sweep, subpoenas for staff phones, and an early push to have the child assigned to a neutral party while the case proceeded. Victoria liked the language because it sounded decisive. She liked the shape of control. To Aaliyah, who had never had the inside of a courtroom was anything other than a rumor or a cautionary tale, the week was an education. Margaret explained what a preliminary hearing did and did not do. It was not a trial. It was a sorting place. The judge would decide whether there was enough concern to justify a more intrusive intervention. Evidence mattered. Testimony mattered. Appearances mattered more than anyone liked to admit.
The morning of the hearing, the city was bright and indifferent, a clean blue that blurred the edges of the world. Trey slept later than usual, and Aaliyah sat in the nursery chair with a mug cupped between her hands like a small talisman. Dwayne stood in the doorway with his coat held over his arm. He had not planned to testify if it could be avoided, but counsel had told him his presence would be important, above all to show the court that a father with means was not stepping away. The courthouse smelled of institutional varnish and paper. The hallway's marble was less polished than that of the penthouse, but the weight of it felt the same. Decisions like furniture set in stone. Margaret arrived first, neutral as a judge in her own right. She mouthed a quick hello to Aaliyah, but kept to the business of the day. Dolores, who had not wanted to come, who had preferred to be at the edges, stood in for the staff as a witness to daily routines. She had an air now of grudging admission, of someone who had been wrong to assume that money bought all certainties. The prelim opened in a room that smelled of coffee and new law books. Judge Harrow was a woman with a short, severe haircut and an unerring sense of what belonged in a hearing. She ran the session with a syntax that allowed little indulgence, procedural, precise, and without melodrama. Carlton Grant presented the petition on Victoria's behalf with the calm ferocity of someone who believed in the force of a well-argued paper. He spoke of best interest and the need for a neutral assessment, of how the child's welfare could be compromised by inconsistent caregiving. He suggested that a temporary reassignment, an independent guardian while assessments were completed, would serve stability. Duane's counsel countered with observations that immediate removal would be destabilizing, that the child had responded favorably to Aaliyah's presence, and that Margaret Sutter's initial observations had not suggested imminent danger. Margaret herself read from a carefully worded note on her pad, a list of behaviors he had observed, the routine of care, the child's attachment cues. She did not mince words. Trey was attached to Aaliyah. The attachment was secure and nurturing in ways that mattered. "There is no indication at this point," she said, her voice level, "that the child is in immediate danger or that his needs are unmet in the day-to-day care provided by Miss Johnson." Carlton swung for a different line. He asked whether the court should consider all variables, and he referenced rumors, concerns was the term he used, about Aaliyah's past. The room shifted like a theater catching a note. Aaliyah felt a small coldness in her stomach, as if someone had slid a window open overnight. Carlton's questioning was a deliberate probe. He asked about stability, asked whether being an uncredentialed caregiver disqualified someone in the eyes of the court.
His tone implied yet did not dare the worst. He sought to let the jury of public perception do the dirty work. Margaret answered him with a kind of professionalism that steadied the room. She described what she had seen, a woman who had demonstrated consistent, nurturing behaviors, who had built routines, who had worked within the household's rules. She declined to speculate on Aaliyah's past, stating that what mattered in her role was current patterns of care. "We evaluate what is observable," she said. "Past choices, unless they pose an active risk to the child, are not determinative." The line reframed the exchange: care as present work, not as biography. When it was Aaliyah's turn, she walked into testimony with a careful humility. She did not let the room strip her of dignity by shrinking. She spoke in the plain cadence she used with Trey, clear, direct, and honest. She described the night she had hummed, the way the lion toy had been a bridge, the small rituals of naps and pancakes. She answered Carlton's questions about qualifications calmly. "No fancy certificates," she said, "only experience. No white papers, only a man who had held a child and hummed until the child slept." When Carlton asked whether she had made private choices in the past that might complicate matters, she nodded, because she would not lie, but she also framed it with a boundary. The past chose no one present. "I did what I thought kept my child safe," she said, voice steady. "I would not put another child in danger." The line landed like a small stone. It did not provide the dramatic exoneration the tabloids would later demand. It provided instead an essential humanizing clarity. Aaliyah did not confess in a way that left her vulnerable to judgment. She offered truth on her own terms. The judge listened, and the room listened, and something shifted toward the human rather than the procedural. Dolores surprised some by being a careful witness in Aaliyah's favor. She spoke brusque and direct of the daily specifics, how Aaliyah soothed with a voice, how she made the child's lunch, how she folded tiny shirts with hands that knew the particular pressure of small fabrics. Her speech was pragmatic rather than moralizing, and it carried the kind of weight that the judge found persuasive. "We can argue pedigree," Dolores said, "but what I know is who comes to this nursery every morning with clean hands and a map of what the child needs." Carlton pursued a line about surveillance, about the possibility that what had been seen on video did not tell the whole truth. He hinted that meticulousness in the house sometimes produced blind spots. He requested forensic evidence, that any footage be examined for tampering, and that staff phones be made available for inspection. He did not yet have proof of tampering. He had only the shape of suspicion.
Judge Harrow ordered a neutral forensic sweep and placed a careful marker on the record. Any unlawful act, if discovered, would be pursued. The judge also declined to remove Aaliyah or impose an immediate guardianship change, citing Margaret's observations and the risk of further destabilizing the child. Instead, she ordered a thorough assessment, home studies, forensic analysis of electronic files, and a report due in 30 days. It was, in legal terms, a pause, but not an end. After the hearing, the press began to gather in the courthouse vestibule, as if an invisible scent had signaled news. There were freelance reporters, a camera from a morning show, and a stringer who smelled of too many early mornings. Duane issued a brief statement that thanked the court for careful consideration and asked for privacy. Aaliyah, guided by counsel, offered nothing beyond a short thank you to Margaret for her presence. The camera lights felt intrusive, but there was, also, an odd sense of relief. The court had not ejected her from the house, and the child remained where the child felt safe. But the legal pause did not end the fight outside the courtroom. The forensic sweep turned into an investigation that smelled of something more deliberate than sloppy oversight. Anthony Connors, a private investigator with a knack for shadow work, had been circulating in the house's orbit. He had been hired through intermediaries, small checks and untraced emails that John from the PR team had later called frictionless. When digital traces were followed, they led not directly to Victoria, but to a network woven through friends of the family, the kind of clean hands that shielded the principal actor. Anthony was a man whose CV read like a ledger: international clients, discreet results. He arrived at the house a week after the petition, claiming he had been engaged to secure the family's security interests. The tech sweep turned up what no reasonable person could call mere coincidence: a small, professionally concealed microphone hidden in a ceiling fixture in the nursery, a compact camera tucked behind a shelf in the playroom, its wiring running into a void in the wall, and more damning to a casual observer, a thumb drive containing short clips, some of which were edited to cut away context and craft a narrative of instability. The clips were not overtly defamatory in language, they functioned by omission: a crying child without the calming sequence, a nanny's fluster without showing the steady minutes that followed. The forensics lab, led by a meticulous analyst named Simone Reyes, pulled apart the clips. Metadata showed timestamps that did not correspond to the camera's internal clock. Files indicated a pattern of export and re-encoding consistent with manipulative editing. Simone's report was clinical and devastating in its implications.
She testified to the types of edits she had found, to the likely tools used, and to the odd chain of custody that suggested the footage had been exported, altered, and reintroduced. She could not say who had done it. The lab does not do motive. But she could say this: the footage had been manipulated in a way consistent with a deliberate attempt to craft a narrative. Under cross-examination, Carlton pressed at the margin, asking about the certainty of lab results, about the possibility of error. Simone's answers were careful. Forensics is not conviction, it is correlation. The files show editing, she said. They do not show intent. Intent is not my domain. Investigations do not move in straight lines. They wind through human choices. Anthony Connors' invoices traced back to an intermediary company whose address belonged to a shell operation. Carlton's legal filings, when combed through by Duane's counsel, revealed emails that suggested knowledge of an active surveillance plan. The trail ran cold near Victoria's firewall: clean accounts, assistants who claimed ignorance, and a network of plausible deniability. But there were edges: a scheduler who remembered a quick phone call from Victoria's assistant, and a receipt for an overnight courier that matched the time a drive had been delivered to the law office Carlton used. The accretion of small cases created pressure. Meanwhile, the PR war began to thrum louder. Victoria's allies fed selected clips to a local news site and to a social account that specialized in society gossip. The clips, edited and out of context, played to the prejudices of a public keen to believe a simple story: a naive woman with an unstable past had stepped into a gilded world and endangered a child. It was a tidy narrative, easy to follow, easy to share. The comments rustled like a wind in a field: accusations, threats, and the kind of cruelty that hides in anonymity. Aaliyah felt it in the small way people do when the public assumes license to judge. She saw the headlines on her phone and the sharp intake of staff when they scrolled. Duane's team countered with legal pressure, cease and desist letters, demands for takedowns, and a carefully crafted statement that emphasized the ongoing forensic review and the presumption of due process. But legal responses are measured, and social media rewards speed. The story began to mutate into a spectacle. In private, Duane grieved the way that something so quiet and sacred, a child's attachment, had become content. It was in the middle of this that Aaliyah made a choice that would tip the scale. The legal counsel suggested a press release. The PR firm wanted a controlled, pre-approved statement. What Aaliyah wanted, quietly and unmistakably, was to tell the truth in her own words. She had walked into the nursery without a certificate, without a resume, but with a capacity to keep a child safe.
She had also, years earlier, made a wrenching choice about Elijah that she had never discussed widely, because the act of telling would reopen an ache she had learned to carry in private. Counsel warned her about sealed records and the delicacy of discussing adoption on public airwaves. They reminded her of the risk, how opponents could twist a partial truth. Margaret advised restraint. Lucille said gently, "You tell what feels like the whole of it." But there was another voice too, the voice of the child who had pressed his cheek to hers. The public needed the human shape of the story, not only lawyers' memos. She agreed, after late-night talks with Dwayne and counsel, to do a controlled interview with a local morning program, Emily Blake at Channel 7, a journalist known for her sympathetic line and for doing more than show headlines. The segment would be an opportunity to put the record straight, to humanize the person the cameras had been willing to reduce. They negotiated questions and set boundaries. Certain topics would be off-limits for the first round. Aaliyah took a breath, and then, in the quiet before lights came up, she decided to add something of herself that she would not later regret hiding. When the cameras rolled, the studio was a small, bright world with soft furniture and the hum of technicians. Emily Blake had a way with a microphone that did not weaponize curiosity and that allowed people space to breathe. She asked about the nursery, about Trey's routines, about the humming that had first quieted him. Aaliyah answered in the voice she used with Trey. Simple sentences, concrete images, her hands carving the air as if folding words into small, safe shapes. Then the conversation folded into the question everyone wanted answered. Who is Aaliyah Jontrum? The earlier script called for a short answer about being a janitor and a caregiver. Aaliyah took the camera's gaze and pulled from the folds of her life a story that was not a confession but a claim. She spoke of Elijah, the photograph taped inside her locker, the decision she had made in a small hospital room in 2018 when she had been fragile and exhausted and had not the resources to keep both herself and a new child safe. She did not drop legal specifics about sealed records into the conversation. She simply told her truth. I gave my son a life I could not provide at the time, she said, voice steady. It was the hardest decision I have ever made. It was not a decision made lightly, and it was not one made without love. I have lived with it every day. She did not frame it as heroism. She framed it as survival, a fact that carried dignity because she claimed it and because she did not ask for pity. She spoke of postpartum fear, of nights that blurred into a panic she did not yet name, and of the nurse who had gently said the words that allowed her to make the choice she thought would keep the baby safe. The language was careful, the terms not clinical dossiers, but human acts.
She told the viewers she had made peace with the choice in the sense she had learned to live with it, and that she did not resent the family who had raised Elijah. She had, she said, been able to sleep some nights, knowing he was loved. What she did not do was hand over evidence of sealed documents. She did not need to. Her admission was an act of agency. She chose what to disclose, how to frame it, and when. The admission reconfigured the story away from the easy caricature. People do not always loosen their grip on prejudice at once, but the live human voice does something the edited clip cannot. It creates a person. Emily's follow-up question, about whether this history made her unstable, was met with Aaliyah's steady line. Being a mother did not make me dangerous. It made me careful. The interview hit the public feed like a cool wind. Comments shifted. There were still cruel voices, those always exist, but there were more that offered solidarity. Women wrote about similar choices and about the thinness of support systems. Single mothers offered messages of thanks. A small flood of emails came into the Channel 7 inbox, stories of survival, of nurses who had offered alternatives, of court deadlines that had been frightening when told without context. The story had become, for a moment, a mirror in which people saw complexity instead of a neat outline. Victoria's handlers responded the way machine-driven PR teams do, with a grim, tactical escalation. They amplified the clips they had purchased. They sent a batch of photos, images of Aaliyah near a daycare where Elijah might be, hoping to create the impression of surveillance and menace. Lawyers sent aggressive letters accusing Aaliyah of stalking. The PR campaign's aim was to create fear and to muddy the water of sympathy with a different kind of suspicion. That was when the forensics report widened. Simone's team dug deeper into the chain of custody of the edited clips and the thumb drive. She worked with a cybersecurity consultant who traced file transfers through a series of encryption proxies. The encryption trail folded back toward a discrete Dropbox used by a small vendor hired by a firm with ties to Victoria's social circle. It was not the solid slam dunk of evidence that would convict someone in a criminal court, but it was enough to turn up a connection and to justify further subpoenas. The pings and server logs, requested through lawful procedure, showed an IP address that resolved to an agency that had overlapped with Anthony Connor's invoices. Anthony, confronted with the accruing evidence, did what many do in a tight spot. He became a weather vane for the truth. Under pressure, he admitted to being contracted to place discrete devices in client properties and to retrieve clips on demand. He claimed he had been paid to gather security footage. When pushed, he allowed that in some instances he had generated short edits for clients who wanted highlights.
He gave names of intermediaries, emails, and invoices that led back to a cleaning concierge that had done odd jobs for Victoria's social calendar. Each new piece of paper made the constellation clearer. It did not prove Victoria had ordered the edits. It did prove that there had been a small, well-funded operation to craft content to define what the public saw. The legal consequences circled like a flock. Civil notices, potential subpoenas for assistance, and the whisper of an inquiry into the ethics of the Foundation's governance. Board members, watching the donor rolls and the risk to reputational capital, convened. They were an old-school group who preferred boardroom decisions to public spectacle. When the evidence surfaced enough to make them uncomfortable, their loyalty frayed. Victoria, who had imagined her stewardship as a kind of moral clarity, found herself isolated by the thing she prized most: control. The board voted to open an independent review of the chain of events and to suspend certain investigative expenditures pending a formal audit. Victoria, who had always measured victory in the tightening of narratives, found that the board's appetite for risk had diminished. The legal case at the family court reached its own turning point. Judge Harrow received Margaret's full report, Simone's forensic summary, and the supplemental findings that suggested tampering with footage. She set a path forward that balanced caution with children's welfare. She declined to grant the emergency guardianship Victoria had sought. Instead, she ordered a comprehensive assessment and extended the timeline for final determination while imposing a protective order against the unauthorized recording of the child. She authorized limited discovery into the provenance of the edits and the placement of devices, and referred questions of potential criminal conduct to the district attorney's office. In essence, she drew a line. Private lives were not content to be weaponized without consequence. The district attorney's office, now formally aware of potential illegal surveillance, opened an inquiry into Anthony and into the chain of procurement. Being investigated is not the same as being charged, and the office moved with its own rhythm of evidence and dispatches. But the inquiry functioned as a pressure valve. It slowed the breath of rumor and shifted the energy back into documented processes. Where there had been only social media shouts, there was now the slow business of subpoenas and testimony. Publicly, the narrative began to soften. The humans behind the headlines re-emerged. Letters came in, from women who had stood in hospital corridors with impossible choices, from social workers who underlined the need for supports rather than judgments, from anonymous donors offering to match funds for a program that would do what the headline writers ignored: help single mothers in crisis. The volume of support allowed Dwayne and Aaliyah to do something practical.
They could have reacted with lawsuits and countersuits, but instead they opted to use the attention as a resource. They created a plan, initial and modest, to seed a small relief fund for mothers who are vulnerable, a pilot program that would provide temporary housing assistance, counseling, and legal support for mothers in the months after childbirth, when risks were highest. The idea of the foundation was not born in a press release. It was born over pancakes, when Dwayne, half awake, asked Aaliyah a simple question. If you could change one thing about what you experienced, what would it be? She thought of a nurse with a hand on her shoulder, the way Lucille had sat beside her in a kitchen and said simply, "You did what you could." She thought of Elijah and of the night air after she had walked away. People need options, she said. They need someone to tell them there is a way forward that doesn't end in losing everything. Dwayne listened, and as someone whose philanthropic instincts had always been part of his public profile, he accepted that the city's wealth could try to respond to the hole that had nearly swallowed her. They launched the foundation quietly at first, a legal entity, a small board including Margaret, Lucille, and a couple of donor advisors who believed in safety nets rather than judgments. They announced a modest pilot program and set up a hotline that connected desperate mothers to social services and wraparound care. The PR firm did the press release, but the fuel was already in place, the calls of women who had been waiting for something like this. Donations trickled in at first, then grew as the human story took hold. The narrative had swung from spectacle to service, and the public reacted. The legal processes continued in the background. Anthony faced civil subpoenas and the possibility of charges related to illegal surveillance. The board's independent review resulted in recommendations that reshaped governance and transparency, and Victoria, under pressure and with her influence diminished, chose to resign rather than face protracted inquiry. She left behind an estate of bruised relationships and a lesson that control via rumor and surveillance has tangible consequences. She did not land in disgrace as some might have wished, nor did she find absolution. She retreated into a quieter orbit and engaged counsel to manage reputation repair. The result was human, ugly, and plausible, accountability without theatrics. Aaliyah's life did not become magically easier because the board shifted or because the DA opened a file. She continued to care for Trey with the same attention, the timed naps, the way she sang certain songs that always settled him. Legal sessions created new rhythms, depositions, home inspections, supervised evaluations, but none of these replaced the small rituals of early waking and the way a child's hand wraps around your finger as if to tether the world.
The court ultimately ordered a formal home study and recommended ongoing supervision and additional family support services. The final custody decision was not an instant declaration of family reconfiguration. It was a legally mediated path that recognized the father's guardianship, acknowledged Aaliyah's crucial role as caregiver, and required ongoing monitoring and services. An outcome that, while imperfect, recognized the complexity of love, attachment, and parental responsibility. The months that followed were both quiet and intense. Aaliyah met Elijah once, at a distance. The meeting was arranged carefully through the adoptive parents who had raised him with love and who wanted nothing more than to protect their son's tranquility. They agreed to a brief exchange, a neutral park bench where families walked dogs and children scrambled up slides. Aaliyah stood across the expanse, her heart a slow drum. Elijah was older now, a little taller, his hair a similar texture to the photograph tucked inside her locker. He held his mother's hand, their mother, and looked like a child who had known safety. When their eyes met across the grass, Aaliyah felt a surge that was not possessive but grateful. She did not reach out. The moment was not for reclaiming. She smiled, and he smiled back in the casual way of kids who make small recognitions of people who once mattered. It was enough. She walked away with a lightness she had not expected, a peace that had nothing to do with restitution and everything to do with knowing he was well. Dwayne and Aaliyah's relationship found an axis that was not romance's early heat, but a steady, mutual tending. They shared evenings of quiet conversation and occasional lunches where they planned foundation strategy. There were small intimacies. He learned the exact way she liked tea. She learned to accept the way he carried grief like a private ledger. They kissed once, gently and consensually, after a long meeting when the house felt particularly like a place of work and repair. The moment was not a fairy tale, but a carefully chosen human exchange between two adults who had learned to respect boundaries and consent, and who, slowly, allowed themselves the possibility of care. Romance was not the end point of the story. It was one of the many ways people rebuild trust. Dolores's arc, which had opened as a kind of gatekeeping toughness, deepened into a protective, practical affection. She took pride in the nursery. She admitted, awkwardly to Aaliyah in the kitchen one afternoon, that she had been wrong to assume certain things about the kind of people who could hold a child. Her apology was a small, private thing, unadorned by fanfare. It mattered because it was authentic. Lucille visited often, bringing soups and the kind of prosaic comfort that turned healing into a practice. She sat with Aaliyah on long nights and whispered, not advice, but witness. "You carried the song," she said. "That's no small thing."
The Foundation's work took on a life of its own. They focused on what a single, targeted program could achieve: temporary housing vouchers for postpartum mothers, legal navigators who could counsel on adoption and custody questions, and counseling sessions staffed by trained clinicians who had experience with postpartum disorders. They partnered with the local hospital to pilot a hotline that connected nurses to social workers, and within months, they had enough small, demonstrable impact to write grant proposals for scaling. The stories that came back were varied and human. A mother who stayed with her child instead of giving them up because a counselor had helped her find housing. A woman who got help for depression and learned to nurse again without shame. Those letters arrived folded in with checks and notes from donors who said they had once judged and chosen instead to act. The media's appetite moved on as it always does, but the new narrative had teeth. People no longer only read about a scandal, they heard about a program that had prevented harm. The channel stories that had once slavishly regurgitated clicks now ran pieces on postpartum support and on the ethics of surveillance. Journalists began interviewing Margaret about child advocacy norms and asked Simone about the need for stronger protections against unauthorized recording. The public conversation expanded beyond one woman's past into what systems were necessary to keep families safe and to avoid weaponizing private lives. The case eventually resolved into a settlement that was less sensational than some expected and more realistic than others. Victoria agreed to step down from certain roles and to contribute to the Foundation's independent review committee, an act that some interpreted as penance and others as pragmatic reputation management. Anthony Connors faced investigations and ultimately lost certain contracts when credentials failed to hold up under subpoena. Some legal loose ends took longer to tie, civil suits move in slow water, but the larger arc favored repair over catharsis. Months later, the house settled into a new rhythm. The nursery's lion toy kept its post atop Trey's pillow, and Aaliyah kept humming certain lines that had become theirs by practice. The Foundation's pilot rolled out, and the first cohort of mothers graduated from the initial program, with housing stability and access to counseling. Aaliyah sometimes attended the sessions, not as a front-facing celebrity, but as a peer who had been through the program the hard way. Women gathered around a small table and spoke without fear of being judged, and when they laughed, it sounded like the honest, slightly brittle thing that happens when people recognize they are not alone. There were quieter victories that mattered more than headlines.
Trey took a step, stumbling the way children do, and Aaliyah was there to catch him. The two of them played on the living room rug and built towers that toppled with theatrical sighs. Dwayne watched from the doorway with the private look of a man who had finally, in increments, learned how to be present. He attended foundation meetings and sometimes sat in the back of a group session, listening with the attentive silence of someone seeking to learn. The house, once a stage for power, had been repopulated with the small, ordinary acts of care. Laundry done by hands that knew the exact pressure to press hems, books read aloud until eyes drooped, the sleepy ritual of tucking in. Aaliyah's relationship with her past remained a thing she carried, not a drama to be aired for entertainment. She had closure enough in that day at the park. She also had a sense of being heard, first in court, then on television, and ultimately in the small exchanges with women who wrote to say how her courage had helped them seek help. She did not become a hero in the mythic sense. She became, instead, a person whose choices had compelled institutions to look at their edges and at the people they served. That felt like a different kind of victory, systemic nudges toward compassion rather than the revenge of sensational headlines. On a late autumn evening, months after the first petition, Aaliyah sat by the nursery window with Trey asleep and the city lights ascatter beyond glass. She hummed the hymn she had first used in the nursery, the one that had begun everything. Dwayne came and sat beside her, not with the force of a man who sought to repair an Endel's past, but with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to be present. They did not speak of future promises or tidy endings. They talked instead about the Foundation's recent intake and about a mother who had found an apartment through the program. The conversation was practical and warm, and more important, ordinary. "Do you ever regret it?" Dwayne asked, finally, voice low. Aaliyah considered him. The question was not the one she had spent nights answering alone. Regret was not a single thing. Pain had been part of all her choices. "Sometimes," she said, "but regret is not the same as shame. I've done what I needed to do. I've learned how to help others not have to make the same choice without support." He nodded. He reached out and took her hand, not in a declaration, but as a gesture of partnership. The house hummed. Downstairs, some staff were laughing over a radio. Dolores had left a steaming pot of something on the stove and a note that said, in her clipped style, "Eat, then sleep." The foundation that bore Aaliyah's name, if only in small print, opened a simple office above a community center. They hired counselors, a part-time lawyer to help with filings, and a coordinator who ran the hotline late into the evening, the way many programs must in their awkward early months.
Grant money came in, not enough to solve structural poverty, but enough to show that small systems change the slope of lives. Women who had once read headlines that tore at them now found a place to be helped. The last scenes of ordinary life, the ones that feel like epilogues not because everything is wrapped neatly, but because what remains is steady and lived, were small and particular. Trey, now older by a season, painted a picture of a lion with too much purple and too many teeth. Aaliyah pinned it to the living room wall with tape and a slightly crooked hand and called it art. Dwayne learned to make pancakes in the exact way she liked them, thin and slightly crisp at the edges. Dolores, whose brusque affection had softened into a kind of rough tenderness, would bring by mending work and sit in a chair as if presence itself were a means of care. Lucille, with her steady hands and unshocking cheer, announced that the foundation should offer knitting nights as a way to build community. It did, and people came. One late evening, when the house was quiet and the city lights were a low constellation, Aaliyah stood at the nursery window and let the hymn rise. Not because it would fix everything, but because it had become a way to mark a life she had refused to let be erased. She had been spat upon in rumor and dismissed in the way the powerful dismiss the inconvenient. She had also been pressed a child's cheek and found there a human map that guided her. The world had shown its worst edges: surveillance, weaponized gossip, boards that peddled reputation instead of justice, and it had also shown its capacity for kindness when people looked beyond sensation to the structures that cause harm. If the title that once read like a provocation, "All Nannies Spat Upon by the Billionaire's Son," had been a hook, the rest had been an arc, from the sensational to the humane, from accusation to accountability, from a private wound to a public commitment to do better. The surprise had not been that a maid had calmed a child. The surprise was that the act of care could force institutions to look at how they managed risk and compassion. The story did not end with a tidy happily ever after. It ended with a quiet affirmation, a woman who chose to speak her truth, a child who found safety,
a foundation that began to stitch new nets under people teetering at the edge. If Aaliyah's story moved you, subscribe to follow the Foundation's work, and consider joining us in supporting programs for new mothers in crisis. Your attention and your action make small mercies possible.